In a world where success is often measured by the size of one's bank account, we find ourselves drawn to stories of the ultra-wealthy. We imagine their lives filled with luxury, ease, and endless satisfaction. But what if I told you that true wealth isn't found in towering skyscrapers or gleaming sports cars? What if the secret to a fulfilling life lay hidden in the most unexpected places, perhaps even on the very streets we walk every day? Welcome to a tale that will challenge everything you thought you knew about success, happiness, and the human spirit. This is the story of Mark Adler, a man who had it all, or so he thought. Prepare yourself for a journey that will take you from the dizzying heights of New York's financial district to the harsh realities of its unforgiving streets. You'll witness a transformation so profound, so unexpected, that it might just change the way you see the world around you. As we delve into Mark's extraordinary odyssey, ask yourself, what truly matters in life? What does it mean to be rich? And most importantly, are you ready to discover a kind of wealth that no amount of money can buy? Settle in, open your mind, and prepare your heart. The story you're about to hear isn't just about one man's fall from grace and eventual redemption. It's a mirror reflecting our own values, judgments, and the untapped potential for compassion that resides within us all. Before we continue, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching this video from. I'd love to know. Let's begin. Mark Adler stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, gazing down at the bustling streets of New York City. 52 stories below, people scurried about like ants, each caught up in their own little world. From this height, they all looked the same, small, insignificant. Yet, as Mark watched them, a familiar ache bloomed in his chest. Despite all his success, he couldn't help but wonder, why did they seem so much more alive? At 45 years old, Mark had achieved what most would consider the American dream. He'd built his empire from the ground up, transforming a small tech startup into a multi-billion-dollar corporation. His name graced the covers of business magazines, his face a symbol of success and ambition. But as he stood there, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth, Mark felt more alone than ever. The office around him was a testament to his achievements. Sleek, modern furniture filled the space, each piece carefully chosen to project an image of power and sophistication. Awards and accolades lined the walls, silent witnesses to years of hard work and sacrifice. Yet for all their shine, they felt hollow now. Mark's eyes drifted to the single-framed photograph on his desk. It was old, the colors fading, but the image was clear. A much younger Mark, arms around his sister Sarah, both of them beaming at the camera. How long had it been since he'd seen her smile like that? How long since he'd smiled like that himself? With a heavy sigh, Mark turned away from the window and sank into his leather chair. His schedule for the day glowed on the computer screen before him. Meetings, conference calls, strategy sessions. Once, these had filled him with excitement, each a new opportunity to grow his empire. Now, they felt like chains, binding him to a life that no longer brought him joy. As he scrolled through his emails, a notification popped up, a reminder of his mother's birthday next week. Mark's finger hovered over the delete button, as it had so many times before. When was the last time he'd actually called her? Sent a card? The realization that he couldn't remember sent a wave of shame through him. But shame was quickly replaced by justification. He was busy, after all. Running a company this size took all his time and energy. His family, they just didn't understand the pressures he was under, the sacrifices he had to make. Deep down, though, Mark knew these were excuses. The truth was, somewhere along his climb to the top, he'd lost sight of what truly mattered. Relationships had been sacrificed on the altar of success, empathy discarded in favor of efficiency. He'd become so focused on accumulating wealth that he'd forgotten how to be wealthy in spirit. As the morning wore on, Mark went through the motions of his day. He listened to reports, made decisions, signed documents. But his mind was elsewhere, grappling with a growing sense of dissatisfaction. The numbers in the reports, once a source of pride, now seemed meaningless. The praise from his executives rang hollow. Lunchtime came and went, Mark opting to eat alone in his office as usual. As he picked at his overpriced salad, His gaze was drawn once again to the streets below. He watched as office workers spilled out of nearby buildings, gathering in groups, laughing and chatting as they headed to lunch together. The sight stirred something in him, a longing for connection he'd long suppressed. Afternoon brought more of the same: meetings, phone calls, decisions. But with each passing hour, Mark felt increasingly disconnected from it all. The empire he'd built, once his greatest source of pride, now felt like a gilded cage. He was trapped, not by external forces, but by the very success he'd worked so hard to achieve. As the workday drew to a close, Mark found himself dreading the return to his empty penthouse apartment. The thought of another evening alone, surrounded by expensive furnishings that brought him no joy, was almost unbearable. On impulse, he decided to walk home instead of taking his usual chauffeured car. Stepping out onto the busy sidewalk, Mark was immediately struck by the energy of the city. The sounds, the smells, the press of bodies. It was overwhelming after the sterile quiet of his office tower. As he began to walk, he found himself noticing things he'd overlooked for years. There was the old man selling hot dogs on the corner, greeting each customer with a warm smile. The young couple walking hand in hand, lost in their own world. The street musician whose soulful melody seemed to touch something deep within Mark's chest. But it was the homeless man huddled in a doorway that truly caught Mark's attention. He'd passed this same spot countless times before, always averting his eyes, quickening his pace. But today, something made him pause. The man looked up, meeting Mark's gaze, and offered a small, kind smile. That smile, so genuine despite the man's obvious hardship, hit Mark like a physical blow. In that moment, he saw not a nameless vagrant, but a fellow human being. One who, despite having nothing, still had the capacity for kindness. The contrast between this man's smile and the empty grins Mark saw daily in his world of high finance was stark. It stirred something in him, a mix of shame, curiosity, and an odd sense of longing. What did this man know that Mark didn't? How could someone with so little seem so much more at peace than someone with everything? As Mark continued his walk home, these thoughts swirled in his mind. The familiar landmarks of his neighborhood seemed different somehow, as if he was seeing them for the first time. The luxury boutiques, high-end restaurants, and sleek gyms that had once represented success now felt like symbols of a hollow existence. Reaching his building, Mark nodded absently to the doorman and made his way to the elevator. As it ascended to the penthouse, he felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to escape. The doors opened, revealing his immaculate, soulless apartment, and Mark felt something inside him break. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't continue living this empty life, surrounded by wealth but devoid of meaning. In that moment, Mark made a decision that would change everything. He would leave it all behind: his company, his wealth, his identity. He would step out into the world and try to find what he'd lost along the way. With shaking hands, Mark packed a small bag with some clothes and essentials. He left his phone, his credit cards, everything that tied him to his old life. As he stood at the threshold of his apartment, hand on the doorknob, a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursed through him. He was about to step into the unknown, to leave behind everything he'd worked for. But for the first time in years, Mark felt truly alive. As he closed the door behind him, he didn't know what the future held. But he knew that whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the gilded cage he was leaving behind. Little did Mark know, his journey was just beginning. The streets of New York, once merely a backdrop to his life of luxury, were about to become his teacher, his challenge, and ultimately, his path to redemption. The first night on the streets was a shock to Mark's system. The noise, the cold, the constant state of alertness. It was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He found himself huddled in the doorway of a closed shop, his expensive coat pulled tight around him, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Mark realized he'd barely slept. His body ached from the hard concrete, and his stomach growled with hunger. The realization hit him hard. He had no money, no food, and no plan. Rising stiffly, Mark began to walk. The city was waking up around him, but it felt different now. He was no longer above it all, looking down from his tower. He was in it, part of the ebb and flow of street life. And for the first time, he felt truly invisible. People rushed past, their eyes sliding over him without really seeing. A woman pulled her child closer as they passed. A businessman quickened his step. Mark, used to commanding attention wherever he went, felt the sting of each averted gaze, each quickened step. As the day wore on, hunger became Mark's constant companion. The smell of food from cafes and food carts was torturous. He considered asking for help, but pride held him back. He, Mark Adler, begging for food? The thought was almost laughable. Almost. By afternoon, desperation had begun to set in. Mark found himself eyeing discarded food containers and trash cans, wondering if there might be something edible inside. The very thought made his stomach turn, but hunger was a powerful motivator. It was then that Mark had his first encounter with true kindness on the streets. As he stood, paralyzed with indecision in front of a half-full trash can, a voice spoke behind him. "First day, huh?" Mark turned to see an older man, his weathered face kind beneath a scraggly beard. The man held out half a sandwich, offering it without judgment or pity. "Name's Kevin," the man said. "Looks like you could use this more than me right now." Mark hesitated, pride warring with hunger. But as his stomach growled audibly, he realized he had little choice. With a mumbled thanks, he took the sandwich, devouring it in a few quick bites. As he ate, Kevin watched him with understanding eyes. "It gets easier," he said softly. "Not better, mind you, but easier. You learn the rhythms of the street, where to find food, where it's safe to sleep." Mark, his mouth full, could only nod. As he swallowed the last bite, he felt a lump form in his throat. This simple act of kindness, from a man who clearly had little to spare, touched him deeply. "Thank you," Mark said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know what I'm doing out here." Kevin's laugh was warm, without mockery. "None of us did at first, but you'll learn. Or you'll go back to wherever you came from. The streets have a way of making that decision for you." As Kevin turned to go, Mark felt a sudden panic. "Wait," he called. "Could you? Would you mind if I stayed with you for a bit? I don't know where to go." Kevin studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But understand this. Out here, we look out for each other. If you're going to stick with me, you need to be willing to do the same for others when the time comes." Mark agreed quickly, grateful for any guidance in this alien world he'd entered. As he followed Kevin through the winding streets, he realized he was taking the first steps on a journey that would change him forever. The next few days were a blur of new experiences, each more challenging than the last. Mark learned the harsh realities of life on the streets, the constant search for food and shelter, the wary eyes of law enforcement, the judgment and sometimes cruelty of passers-by. But he also discovered a sense of community he'd never known before. Among the homeless, there was a camaraderie, a shared understanding. They looked out for each other, shared what little they had. It was a stark contrast to the cutthroat world of high finance he'd left behind. Kevin became Mark's guide and protector in those early days. He showed Mark where to find free meals, which shelters were safest, how to stay warm on cold nights. More than that, he offered friendship, something Mark realized he'd been missing for far too long. As the days turned into weeks, Mark's appearance began to change. His designer clothes became dirty and worn. His neatly trimmed beard grew wild. The manicured nails that had once signed million-dollar deals were now ragged and dirty. But it wasn't just his outward appearance that was changing. Mark found himself looking at the world with new eyes. He saw the struggles of those around him, felt their pain and their resilience. The homeless were no longer faceless entities to be avoided, but individuals with stories, dreams, and dignity. One night, as Mark and Kevin huddled around a small fire with a group of other homeless individuals, Mark found himself sharing his story. He spoke of his rise to wealth and power, and the emptiness that had driven him to the streets. As he talked, he expected judgment or resentment. Instead, he found understanding and even compassion. We've all got our stories, said an older woman named Maria. What matters is what you do with them. Sounds to me like you're trying to find something real. That's more than a lot of folks ever do. Her words stayed with Mark long into the night. As he lay awake, staring at the stars visible between the towering buildings, he realized that he was indeed searching for something real, something that money couldn't buy. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to find it here, among those society had forgotten. But life on the streets was far from easy. There were moments of fear, of despair, of questioning his decision. Mark experienced firsthand the brutality of winter nights without shelter, the gnawing pain of hunger, the crushing weight of society's judgment. Yet through it all, there was a growing sense of purpose. Mark began to see the systemic issues that led to homelessness, the lack of support, the barriers to re-entering society. He saw the resilience and dignity of those fighting to survive each day. And slowly, an idea began to form, a way to use his past to make a real difference in the future. As weeks turned to months, Mark's transformation continued. The hard edges of his personality softened. He learned to listen, truly listen to others. He found joy in simple things, a warm meal, a dry place to sleep, a moment of laughter shared with friends. But even as he adapted to life on the streets, Mark knew this wasn't his final destination. He had learned valuable lessons, gained a new perspective on life and what truly mattered. Now, it was time to take those lessons back into the world he'd left behind. One morning, as dawn broke over the city, Mark made his decision. He would return to his old life, but not as the same man who had left it. He would use his wealth, his influence, to make a difference, to help those who had helped him see the world anew. Saying goodbye to Kevin and the others was harder than Mark had anticipated. These people, once strangers, had become his family. They had seen him at his lowest, had lifted him up, had shown him the true meaning of community. "You're going back, aren't you?" Kevin said, his eyes knowing. Mark nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Kevin smiled, clasping Mark's shoulder. "Good. You've got the power to change things, Mark. Don't waste it. Remember what you've learned here. Remember us." With tears in his eyes, Mark promised he would. As he walked away back towards the life he'd left behind, he knew he was no longer the same man. The streets had stripped away his arrogance, his selfishness. In their place, they had given him empathy, humility, and a new purpose. Mark Adler, the lonely millionaire, was gone. In his place stood a man ready to use his wealth not for personal gain, but for the betterment of others. A man who had learned that true richness comes not from what you have, but from what you give. As he made his way back to his penthouse, Mark's mind was already racing with plans. He would use his resources to create shelters, job training programs, advocacy groups. He would work to change the systems that left so many behind. But more than that, he would strive to be the kind of person he'd met on the streets, kind, compassionate, and genuinely connected to others. The lessons he'd learned couldn't be measured in dollars and cents, but in the profound shift in his understanding of what truly mattered in life. As Mark approached his building, he paused for a moment, taking in the gleaming facade that had once represented the pinnacle of his success. Now, it seemed almost foreign to him, a relic of a past life. The doorman, startled by Mark's disheveled appearance, moved to block his entry. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the doorman said, his voice firm but not unkind. Mark couldn't help but smile. Just months ago, this man had greeted him with deference, holding doors and calling him Mr. Adler. Now, he was just another face on the street, deemed unworthy of entry into this world of luxury. "It's me, Frank," Mark said softly. "Mark Adler. I know I look different, but I can explain." The doorman's eyes widened in recognition, a mix of shock and concern crossing his face. "Mr. Adler? My God," we thought. "There have been search parties, police investigations. Your family has been beside themselves with worry." The mention of his family sent a pang of guilt through Mark's heart. In his journey of self-discovery, he'd given little thought to how his disappearance might have affected those he'd left behind. It was a stark reminder that his actions, however well-intentioned, had consequences beyond himself. "I'm sorry for the trouble I've caused," Mark said, his voice heavy with regret. "I've been on a journey of sorts, one that I needed to take alone. But I'm back now, and things are going to be different." Frank, still visibly shaken, nodded and opened the door. As Mark stepped into the lobby, the contrast between his current state and the opulent surroundings was stark. Residents waiting for the elevator stared openly, whispering behind their hands. But for perhaps the first time in his life, Mark found that he didn't care about their judgment. He knew who he was now, and that knowledge gave him a confidence that no designer suit ever had. The ride up to his penthouse was a quiet one, filled with reflection. As the elevator doors opened, Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. His apartment, once a showpiece of his wealth, now felt hollow and lifeless. The expensive art on the walls, the custom furniture, the state-of-the-art technology, none of it held the same allure it once had. Mark made his way to the bathroom, catching sight of himself in the mirror for the first time in months. The face that stared back at him was barely recognizable. His once neatly trimmed hair was long and unkempt, his designer stubble now a full, scraggly beard. His eyes, though, told a different story. Where once there had been a hard, driven look, there was now a softness, a depth that spoke of the experiences he'd been through. As he showered and changed into clean clothes, Mark's mind raced with plans for the future. He knew that simply returning to his old life wasn't an option. He had been given a gift, a new perspective, a chance to make a real difference in the world, and he was determined not to waste it. His first order of business, he decided, would be to reconnect with his family. He owed them an explanation, an apology, and a chance to be part of his new journey. With trembling hands, he picked up his phone, untouched for months, and dialed his sister's number. "Sarah?" he said when she answered, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's Mark. I'm home, and I have so much to tell you." The conversation that followed was long and emotional. There were tears, recriminations, and eventually forgiveness. Mark shared his experiences, the lessons he'd learned, and his plans for the future. Sarah listened, at first with disbelief, then with growing understanding and support. "You've changed," she said finally, a note of wonder in her voice. "I can hear it. It's like I'm talking to the brother I used to know, before all the money and success." Her words filled Mark with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "I have changed," he agreed, "and I want to keep changing, keep growing. But I can't do it alone. I need my family. I need you, Sarah." As they made plans to meet, to begin rebuilding their relationship, Mark felt a sense of purpose solidifying within him. He had been given a second chance, not just at happiness, but at making a real difference in the world, and he was determined not to waste it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Mark reached out to his company, explaining his absence and his new vision for the future. He spoke of corporate responsibility, of using their resources to address social issues, particularly homelessness and poverty. Some board members were skeptical, but Mark's passion and newfound eloquence in speaking about these issues gradually won them over. He began to restructure his company, creating new divisions focused on social impact and community development. He reached out to experts in the field, including some of the social workers and advocates he'd met during his time on the streets. Their knowledge and experience were invaluable in shaping programs that could make a real difference. But perhaps the most significant change was in Mark himself. The driven, often ruthless businessman was gone, replaced by a man of compassion and purpose. He made time for his family, rebuilding relationships that had been neglected for years. He volunteered at shelters, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as someone who understood the struggles of those he was helping. One day, as Mark was serving meals at a soup kitchen, he spotted a familiar face in the line. It was Kevin, the man who had taken him under his wing during those first difficult days on the street. Their eyes met, and Kevin's face broke into a wide grin. "Well, look at you," Kevin said as he reached the serving station. "Seems like you found your way after all." Mark felt tears prick his eyes as he clasped Kevin's hand. "I did," he said softly. "Thanks to you, to all of you. You taught me what really matters in life." Kevin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Just remember, it's not about giving handouts. It's about giving people a chance, some dignity. That's what makes the real difference." "I know," Mark replied, "and I promise I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen, for as many people as possible." As Kevin moved on, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing systemic issues, shifting societal perceptions. These were monumental tasks. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly equipped to face these challenges. Mark Adler, once defined by his wealth, was now a man defined by his compassion, his understanding, and his commitment to making a difference. The journey that had begun in despair on the streets of New York had led him to a place of profound purpose and contentment. As he continued serving meals, exchanging smiles and words of encouragement with each person who came through the line, Mark knew that he had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not success as the world defined it, but a life of meaning, of connection, of real impact. The lonely millionaire was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in the ability to touch and improve the lives of others. And in that, Mark Adler had become rich beyond measure. The sun was just beginning to peek over the New York skyline as Mark Adler stepped out of his building. But unlike the rushed, purposeful stride of his past, his steps were now measured, his eyes open to the world around him. He paused to greet the doorman, Frank, with a warm smile and a genuine inquiry about his family. This small interaction, once overlooked in his busy life, now felt profoundly important. As he walked the familiar streets of his neighborhood, Mark saw them with new eyes. The homeless man on the corner was no longer an uncomfortable sight to hurry past, but a fellow human being with a story, a life, and inherent dignity. Mark stopped, offering not just spare change, but a moment of conversation, of real human connection. His destination this morning was a meeting that would have been unthinkable just months ago. In a small, no-frills cafe, far from the upscale eateries he once frequented, Mark was meeting with a group of advocates for the homeless. Among them was Kevin, the man who had become his mentor and friend during his time on the streets. As Mark entered the cafe, the group fell silent, their eyes wary. Despite his now familiar face at shelters and soup kitchens, there was still an undercurrent of skepticism. Could a man of such wealth and privilege truly understand their struggles, their needs? Mark felt their doubt, but it didn't deter him. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. He knew he had to earn their trust, to prove that his commitment was genuine and lasting. "Thank you all for coming," Mark began, his voice soft but firm. "I know many of you are wondering why I'm here, what my true motives are. The truth is, I'm here because I've seen firsthand the challenges you face every day. I've lived them, albeit briefly. And I've come to understand that I have a responsibility to use my resources, my influence, to make a real difference." He paused, looking each person in the eye before continuing. "But I also know that I don't have all the answers. You are the experts here. You know the real needs, the systemic issues that need to be addressed. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to work alongside you to create meaningful change." As the meeting progressed, Mark listened more than he spoke. He heard stories of bureaucratic roadblocks, of programs that looked good on paper but failed in practice, of the daily struggles faced by those living on the streets. He took notes furiously, his mind racing with ideas, connections, possibilities. One woman, a social worker named Maria, spoke passionately about the need for comprehensive support. "It's not just about providing a bed for the night," she explained. "It's about addressing the root causes, mental health issues, addiction, lack of job skills. We need programs that see the whole person, that provide ongoing support." Kevin nodded in agreement. "And dignity," he added. "So many programs treat the homeless as problems to be solved, not as human beings with inherent worth. We need to change that mindset, both in the programs and in society at large." As the meeting wound down, Mark felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. This, he realized, was what had been missing from his life. Not just the drive to succeed, but the passion to make a real, meaningful impact on the world. "Thank you all," he said as they prepared to leave. "This is just the beginning. I promise you I'm in this for the long haul. Together, we're going to make a difference." The group dispersed, some still skeptical, others cautiously optimistic. Kevin lingered behind, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "You meant all that, didn't you?" he said, more a statement than a question. Mark nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I did. Kevin, I owe you so much. You showed me a world I never truly saw before, taught me lessons I'll never forget. I want to honor that, to make sure others have the chance to rebuild their lives, to find their worth." Kevin clasped Mark's shoulder, his grip firm. "Then do it," he said simply. "But remember, this isn't about you being some kind of savior. It's about empowering people, giving them the tools and the chance to save themselves." With those words echoing in his mind, Mark set out to turn ideas into action. Over the next few months, he threw himself into the work with the same intensity he had once reserved for building his business empire. But this time, the drive came from a place of compassion and genuine desire to help, not from a need to prove his worth through wealth and status. He started by restructuring his company, creating a new division focused entirely on social impact initiatives. He hired experts in social work, urban planning, and public policy, ensuring that their programs were based on real-world experience and evidence-based practices. One of their first major projects was the creation of a holistic support center for the homeless. Unlike traditional shelters, this center would provide not just a place to sleep, but comprehensive services including mental health support, job training, and transitional housing assistance. The design of the center itself was carefully considered, creating a space that was welcoming, dignified, and empowering. As the center took shape, Mark found himself spending more and more time there. He worked alongside the staff, getting to know the individuals who came seeking help. He listened to their stories, celebrated their successes, and learned from their setbacks. Each interaction deepened his commitment and broadened his understanding of the complex issues surrounding homelessness. One day, as Mark was helping to serve lunch at the center, he noticed a young woman sitting alone, her eyes downcast. Something about her demeanor tugged at his heart, reminding him of his own feelings of isolation and despair during his time on the streets. Approaching her table, Mark asked gently, "Mind if I join you?" The woman looked up, surprise and a hint of suspicion in her eyes. She shrugged, a non-committal gesture that Mark took as permission to sit. "I'm Mark," he said, keeping his tone casual. "I volunteer here sometimes. How are you finding the center?" The woman, who introduced herself as Jess, was hesitant at first. But as Mark listened without judgment, showing genuine interest, she began to open up. She spoke of losing her job, of a struggle with depression that had led to her current situation. Her words were tinged with shame, with a sense of failure that Mark recognized all too well. "You know," Mark said softly, "I've been where you are. Not too long ago, I was on the streets myself." Jess looked at him skeptically. "You? But you look so put together." Mark chuckled. "I wasn't always. I had it all by society's standards. Money, power, success. But I was empty inside. It took losing everything, living on the streets, to help me find what really mattered." As he shared his story, Mark saw a spark of hope ignite in Jess's eyes. Here was living proof that things could change, that a new beginning was possible. "The hardest part," Mark concluded, "was learning to see myself as worthy of a better life. To believe that I had something to offer the world. And Jess, I see that in you too. You have worth, you have potential. This is just a chapter in your story, not the end of it." Tears welled up in Jess's eyes, but for the first time in a long while, they were tears of hope rather than despair. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for really seeing me." That conversation stayed with Mark long after he left the center that day. It reinforced his belief in the power of human connection, of the importance of seeing the individual behind the label of homeless. It also sparked a new idea. one that would become a cornerstone of the center's program. Mark proposed a mentorship initiative, pairing individuals who had successfully transitioned out of homelessness with those just beginning their journey. These mentors could offer not just practical advice, but the invaluable gift of understanding and hope. The program was an immediate success. Mark watched with joy as individuals who had once felt hopeless began to flourish, buoyed by the support and belief of those who had walked a similar path. He saw friendships form, confidence grow, and lives transform. As word of the center's success spread, Mark found himself increasingly in the public eye. Journalists sought interviews, politicians asked for consultations, other business leaders wanted to know how they could implement similar programs. Mark approached each opportunity not as a chance for personal glory, but as a platform to advocate for those who often went unheard. In one particularly memorable interview, a skeptical reporter asked Mark about the business sense of his new focus. "Isn't this all cutting into your bottom line? Don't your shareholders object to these charitable endeavors?" Mark's response was calm but impassioned. "You're looking at it all wrong," he explained. "This isn't charity, it's investment, in our community, in human potential. Every person we help transition out of homelessness becomes a contributing member of society. They work, they pay taxes, they stimulate the economy. But more than that, they enrich our community with their talents, their perspectives, their humanity." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "As for our shareholders, yes, some were skeptical at first. But they've seen the results, not just in terms of positive PR, which has actually increased our brand value, but in the tangible improvements in our community. A rising tide lifts all boats. By addressing these fundamental issues in our society, we're creating a more stable, prosperous environment for everyone, including our business." The reporter looked thoughtful, jotting down notes. "You really believe that businesses have a responsibility to address social issues?" "I don't just believe it," Mark replied, his voice filled with conviction. "I know it. I've lived it. Businesses have immense power to shape our world. With that power comes responsibility. We can't just focus on profit at the expense of people and expect society to thrive. It's not sustainable, and frankly, it's not fulfilling." The reporter nodded slowly, a new respect dawning in her eyes. "You've certainly given me a lot to think about, Mr. Adler. One last question. What would you say to other business leaders who might be inspired by your example but aren't sure where to start?" Mark smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Start by listening," he said. "Really listening. Not just to your shareholders or your board, but to your community, to the people your business impacts every day. Ask yourself, how can we use our resources, our influence, to make a positive difference? It doesn't have to be grand gestures. Sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest impact." As the interview concluded, Mark felt a sense of satisfaction. Not from being in the spotlight, that held little appeal for him these days, but from the knowledge that his words might inspire others to action. He knew that addressing the complex issues of homelessness and poverty would take more than just his efforts. It would require a shift in societal attitudes, in how businesses viewed their role in the community. In the months that followed, Mark continued to split his time between running his company and working at the center. He took particular joy in the mentorship program, often sitting in on sessions, always amazed by the resilience and strength he witnessed. One day, as he was leaving the center, he ran into Jess, the young woman he'd spoken to months ago. The change in her was remarkable. Gone was the defeated slump of her shoulders, the wary look in her eyes. She stood tall, a smile lighting up her face. "Mark," she called out, waving him over. "I'm so glad I caught you. I wanted to thank you for everything." Mark shook his head, smiling. "You did all the hard work, Jess. I just provided a little encouragement." "It was more than that," Jess insisted. "You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You believed in me. And now, well, I wanted you to be the first to know. I got a job, a real job with benefits and everything." The pride in her voice brought tears to Mark's eyes. He pulled her into a hug, his heart full. "Jess, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." As they talked, Jess sharing her plans for the future, Mark felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. This moment, this connection, this tangible proof that one life had been changed for the better. This was what true success felt like. Later that evening, as Mark sat in his penthouse apartment, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The view from his window was the same as it had always been, the glittering cityscape, the distant horizon. But his perspective had changed dramatically. He thought about the man he used to be, driven, successful, but ultimately empty. He thought about those first harsh days on the street, the lessons in humility and humanity he'd learned. He thought about Kevin, about Jess, about all the lives that had touched his own. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. It was Sarah, his sister, coming by for their weekly dinner, a tradition they'd started as part of rebuilding their relationship. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, noting his pensive expression. Mark smiled, gesturing for her to join him by the window. "I was just thinking about everything. How much has changed? How much I've changed?" Sarah nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. "You know, when you first came back, I was worried. I thought maybe you'd had some kind of breakdown. But now, Mark, I've never seen you so alive, so purposeful." "I feel alive," Mark agreed. "For the first time in years. Maybe for the first time ever. I feel like I'm doing what I was meant to do." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the city. Then Sarah spoke, her voice soft. "Mom would be proud of you. You know, this is the son she always knew you could be." Mark felt a lump form in his throat at the mention of their mother, gone now for several years. He'd been so caught up in his pursuit of wealth and status that he'd neglected his relationship with her in her final years, a regret that still weighed heavily on him. "I hope so," he said quietly. "I'm trying to make up for lost time, to be the person she always believed I could be." Sarah squeezed his arm gently. "You are, Mark. You really are." As they moved to the dining room, chatting about their days, Mark felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew the work ahead was far from over. There were still challenges to face, systems to change, lives to impact. But he was no longer driven by a need to prove himself, to accumulate more. Instead, he was motivated by a genuine desire to make a difference, to leave the world a little better than he found it. The lonely millionaire was gone. In his place stood a man of purpose, of compassion, of connection. Mark Adler had found his true wealth, not in his bank account, but in the lives he touched, in the community he served, in the love he both gave and received. As he raised a glass to toast with his sister, Mark felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the journey that had brought him here, for the lessons he'd learned, for the second chance he'd been given. And he made a silent promise, to himself, to those he'd met along the way, to those he had yet to help, that he would continue to use his resources, his influence, his very life, to make a positive impact in the world. The night deepened, the city lights twinkled, and in a penthouse high above the streets, two siblings laughed and talked, reconnecting and reaffirming the bonds of family. And Mark Adler, once defined by his wealth, now defined by his humanity, knew that he had finally found his true home, his true purpose, his true self. As the story of Mark Adler comes to a close, it serves as a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the depth of our connections, the breadth of our compassion, and the impact we have on the lives of others. It challenges us to look beyond our own circumstances, to see the humanity in every individual, and to consider how we might use our own resources, whatever they may be, to make a positive difference in the world. Mark's journey from a lonely millionaire to a man of purpose and compassion is more than just a personal transformation. It's a call to action for all of us. It asks us to consider our own values, our own impact on the world around us. Are we using our talents, our resources, our influence in ways that truly matter? Are we seeing the humanity in those around us, especially those who society often overlooks? In a world that often measures success by material wealth and status, Mark's story offers a different perspective. It suggests that true fulfillment comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we give. From the connections we forge, the lives we touch, the positive change we create in our communities and in the world at large. As we reflect on this tale, we're invited to examine our own lives, our own choices. Perhaps we, like Mark, have been chasing success as defined by society, only to find ourselves feeling empty and unfulfilled. Perhaps we've overlooked the struggles of those around us, too caught up in our own pursuits to truly see and connect with others. But Mark's story also offers hope. It reminds us that it's never too late to change course, to redefine what success means to us. It challenges us to step outside our comfort zones, to open our eyes and hearts to the world around us, to find ways to use whatever resources we have, be it wealth, skills, time, or simply our capacity for compassion, to make a positive impact. In the end, the story of Mark Adler is not just about one man's journey from wealth to wisdom. It's about the potential for transformation that exists within each of us. It's about the power of empathy, the importance of human connection, and the profound fulfillment that comes from living a life of purpose and service. As we close this chapter, let us carry with us the lessons learned, the perspectives gained. Let us look at the world around us with new eyes, seeing not just problems to be solved, but opportunities to make a difference. Let us, like Mark, strive to measure our success not by what we have, but by the positive impact we create in the lives of others. For in doing so, we may find, as Mark did, that we become rich beyond measure, not in material wealth, but in the things that truly matter: compassion, connection, purpose, and the knowledge that our lives have made a positive difference in the world. And perhaps in our own way, we too can transform from lonely individuals focused on personal gain to connected, compassionate members of a larger community, using our unique gifts to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, to find their purpose, to live with dignity and hope. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Mark Adler took that step when he walked away from his life of luxury to find meaning on the streets. What will your step be? How will you use your resources, your talents, your time to make a positive impact in your world? The choice, as it always has been, is yours. But remember, as Mark's story shows us, that choice has the power to transform not just your own life, but the lives of countless others. In the end, that may be the greatest wealth of all.